Hi everyone, welcome to another lecture. Last time we continued with PowerPoint 10 by discussing um, mainly the Compromise of 1850, right, which was our agreement on what to do with the lands we got from Mexico after the Mexican-American War, right? It made California free. It let Utah and New Mexico sort of decide what they wanted to do with slavery with regards to popular sovereignty, although they ended up not becoming slave states. Um, it also instituted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it much more of a crime for people to aid and abet escaped slaves. So, despite that, the Underground Railroad still continued, but it did put a lot of pressure on people who wanted to volunteer and help these slaves. We also talked about the Know Nothing Party, right? The Native Americans, big air quotes, who believed in xenophobia and hated immigration, but were kind of torn with regards to slavery. And we also discussed Uncle Tom's Cabin, a huge book that was the second most popular book only to the Bible in the 1800s that changed a lot of people's minds about slavery, but also reaffirmed the black stereotypes that we have today. So today we're going to continue by discussing several topics that really put a strain on the pro versus anti-slavery debate and also are largely credited for kickstarting the Civil War. Okay, so throughout this class, we've discussed various events, laws, people, etc., that have sort of exacerbated tensions leading up to the Civil War, but now we're actually going to start getting into the things that really did cause the Civil War in more strong ways. Okay. So I briefly mentioned this when we discussed Utah and New Mexico last time with the Compromise of 1850, but there was another incident where we had to decide whether these new territories would be free or enslaved. And again, we use the term popular sovereignty, right, which basically lets these states decide for themselves. In the case of Kansas and Nebraska, however, that led to many bloody conflicts. So that's what we're going to discuss today. Here are the Nebraska and Kansas territories superimposed on a map to sort of show you guys what states they eventually became. Okay. So this picture is actually of slaveholders leading their slaves to these territories, right? Kind of reminds me personally of the pictures we looked at with the transatlantic slave trade when they were leading the African slaves to the coast. If you take a look at video A, the Sound Smart series, which we've talked about a couple times before, did a short video on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, if you want to take a look at that. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was passed by the 33rd U.S. Congress that created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and was drafted by Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois and President Franklin Pierce, which most people don't remember Franklin Pierce. I forget about him too. So Douglas, we're going to see a picture of him in the next slide, and we'll talk about him too just because he was the main political opponent of Abraham Lincoln. So besides Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, we consider Douglas to be Lincoln's main enemy. The initial purpose of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was to open up thousands of new farms and make feasible a Midwestern transcontinental railroad. So that's important to consider, right? In addition to creating the U.S. territories of Kansas and Nebraska, the Kansas-Nebraska Act also allowed each territory to decide, under the concept of popular sovereignty, whether they wanted slavery or not, right? So there's that term again. You get to decide for yourself. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, which had prohibited slavery in all U.S. territories west of the Mississippi River and north of the 3630 parallel, which we discussed before, right? So basically, because of this, right, Kansas and Nebraska territories are clearly above this line, right? So by instituting this particular act, you're sort of foregoing that line in the sand, right? The 3630 parallel. That's why the Missouri Compromise is repealed through this act, because you can't really obey the line if you go above it. The popular sovereignty clause of the law led pro and anti slavery elements to flood into Kansas with the goal of voting slavery up or down, resulting in a series of armed conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas. So basically, what happened was they heard that they could choose for themselves whether these states were slave or free, right? So that means that a bunch of pro slavery people flooded in with their slaves, trying to take over the votes for the state. And a bunch of anti-slavery people did the same with regards to their representatives, right? But I mean, if two gangs meet on the playground at 3:00, after school, they're probably going to fight at some point, right? That's, if you have two rival positions, things are getting heated over time. People feel very strongly about this. That's what led to these big tensions. Okay. Controversy surrounding the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a cause of the Civil War. Immediate responses to the passage fell into two classes. Okay. The less common response was held by Douglas's supporters, who believed that the bill would withdraw the question of slavery from the halls of Congress and the political arena, committing it to the arbitration of those who are immediately interested in and alone responsible for its consequences. In other words, they believed that the act would lead decisions about slavery in the hands of the people rather than under the carefully balanced jurisdiction of the federal government. So essentially what this means, right, is that Douglas felt like, hey, the government doesn't need to get involved, which was an old Democratic wish that we had less government. Now the Republicans have that idea. And let's just leave the people to decide what the hell they want. But again, without structure, it's kind of hard, right? If we were in class right now and I had you guys debate about this, about a very controversial topic, I'd need to be your mediator or you guys would get out of hand, right? It's sort of like that. The government is the mediator to make sure people don't kill each other like they did in Kansas during this time. So this is actually a picture of Douglas. What do you look like? The far more common response is one of outrage interpreting Douglas's actions as part of an atrocious plot. Especially in the eyes of the Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was aggression and an attack on the power and belief of free states. The response led to calls for public action against the South, as seen in broadsides that advertised gatherings in northern states to discuss publicly what to do about the presumption of the act. So the Northerners really took this bad, right? Any indication of the spread of the South or slavery will cause an uproar. Right, on either side. So it's really hard, and that's why Thomas Jefferson, we previously read that quote, right, where he sort of predicted the Civil War, because he's like, you can try to balance these things as much as you want, but it's going to tip over eventually, which is what happened. Douglas and former Illinois Representative Abraham Lincoln aired their disagreement over the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 7 public speeches during September and October 1854. These are 7 speeches, 3 to 5 hours each, right? Just debates. Lincoln wanted way more than that, but Douglas was like, nah. Lincoln liked to talk. Lincoln gave his most comprehensive argument against slavery and the provisions of the act in the Peoria, Illinois speech on October 16th. He and Douglas both spoke to the large audience, Douglas first and Lincoln in response 2 hours later. Can you imagine making a 2-hour speech? I couldn't even do this lecture recorded if it was 2 hours long, because my voice would be dead. I don't know how Lincoln did it. Lincoln's 3-hour speech presented thorough moral, legal, and economic arguments against slavery and raised Lincoln's political profile for the first time. So this really set him up to be somebody important in politics. The speeches set the stage for the Lincoln-Douglas debates 4 years later, when Lincoln sought Douglas's Senate seat, which Lincoln would lose, but he would win the presidency. So here's an excerpt from the Peoria speech. So Lincoln said, "It shows that the judge has no very vivid impression that the Negro is a human, and consequently has no idea that there can be any moral question in legislating about him." So he's talking about the Dred Scott case, which we're going to talk about today, which basically said that black people were not people, they were property. In his view, the question of whether a new country shall be slave or free is a matter of as utter indifference as it is whether his neighbor shall plant his farm with tobacco or stock it with horned cattle. Now, whether this view is right or wrong, it is very certain that the great mass of mankind take a totally different view. They consider slavery a great moral wrong, and their feelings against it is not evanescent but eternal. It lies at the very foundation of their sense of justice, and it cannot be trifled with. It is a great and durable element of popular action, and I think no statesman can safely disregard it. So what Lincoln's arguing is saying that at the tail end of his argument against the judge who decided against Dred Scott, which again we're going to talk about in a little bit, he's saying that the majority of people don't want slavery, that they know it's morally wrong, that they know it's bad, and that if you're a politician, you can't ignore that most people want this gone. So yeah, this speech was really important in setting Lincoln up as a politician, because before that he was a lawyer for most of his life. Here is one Kansas-Nebraska battle. These battles would also they would contribute to the rise of Mr. John Brown, who we will talk about, I think, next time. Yeah, very important figure during this time. And here's another one, right? This one says the Marais de Cygnes massacre in Kansas on May 19th, 1858. And you can't really tell which side is which is very indicative of sort of our beliefs, right? Because you can't tell what someone believes just by looking at them in some cases, right? That everybody kind of looks the same. You'd have to hear them speak in order to know what they believe. Okay. So now we're going to talk about when one senator beat the shit out of another senator in broad daylight. My students always love this one. I don't know if it's their love for violence, or they just think it's scandalous that two senators would beat the shit out of each other. Nowadays we have senators insult each other, and then the person who got insulted makes a speech, and the person who insults them makes a speech. Like, there's really no like battling like there used to be. But you know, this is the old Congress. So let's talk about why this guy got his ass kicked. So this is actually the assailant, okay, in this incident. This is Mr. Preston Brooks. So on May 20th, 1856, Senator Charles Sumner made a speech denouncing the crime against Kansas and the Southern leaders whom he regarded as complicit, including Senator Andrew Butler. Sumner compared Butler with Don Quixote, from a famous book, for embracing a prostitute prostitute in this speech meant slavery, as his mistress, saying Butler believes himself a chivalrous knight. He said, of course he has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery. So basically calling Butler a pimp that uses slavery as his prostitute. Now, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois was also there, and was also the subject of criticism during the speech. Suggested to a colleague while Sumner was orating that this damn fool Sumner is going to get himself shot by some other damn fool. So Stephen Douglas was like, yo, dude, you're going too far. Sumner's language was intentionally inflammatory. Southerners often claimed that abolition would lead to intermarriage and miscegenation, aka interracial babies, arguing that abolitionists opposed slavery because they wanted to have sex with and marry black women. You see how out of hand this is getting? Abolitionists reversed the argument by accusing Southerners of loving slavery so they could have slave mistresses at their disposal. So basically, they both used black women in inflammatory ways. Like, they both said each side just wanted to have sex with black women, whether black women consented or not. Brooks thought of challenging Sumner to a duel because not only was Brooks, who was a Southern delegate, offended by this, right? He was a delegate from South Carolina, but also his cousin was Butler, who Sumner was making accusations of being a pimp. So he was like really offended. Okay. So a duel, basically, that's how Alexander Hamilton died, right? You challenge someone to a duel, you turn your back to each other with pistols, you walk 10 paces, turn around real quick and shoot each other. Okay. But those are illegal. So when he asked his friend Mr. Keat, or Lawrence M. Keat, who was also a South Carolina Democrat, so Brooks asked him, like, hey, should we do a duel? Keat basically insulted Sumner again and was like, yeah, duels are for gentlemen with equal standing. So basically saying, like, that guy is below you, so a duel is too good for him. Like, petty. So Brooks then decided to punish Sumner with a public beating. Okay. So on May 22nd, 2 days after Sumner's speech, Brooks entered the Senate chamber in company with Keat, right, his friend who said that Sumner was below them. Brooks confronted Sumner, who was seated at his desk writing letters. He said, Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine. So basically, he's saying your speech is trash, you diss my cousin, and you diss my state, and that's bullcrap, right? I like teaching this as well. It's just so funny. As Sumner began to stand up, Brooks hit Sumner over the head several times with his cane, made of thick gutta percha with a gold head, so it's pretty thick wood or material. Sumner was trapped under the heavy desk, which was bolted to the floor, but Brooks continued to beat him until Sumner wrenched the desk from the floor in an attempt to escape. By this time, Sumner was blinded by his own blood. He staggered up the aisle and collapsed unconscious. Others attempted to restrain Brooks before he killed Sumner, but were blocked by Keat, who brandished a pistol and shouted at the onlookers to leave Brooks and Sumner alone. Brooks continued beating Sumner until the cane broke. That's pretty hard. Then quietly left the chamber with Keat. Brooks required medical attention before leaving the Capitol because he had hit himself above his right eye with one of his back swings. So literally, the dude stopped to get medical attention because he's like, I beat this other dude so hard, I kind of hit myself. Like, what kind of crap is that? Sumner suffered head trauma that would cause him chronic pain and symptoms consistent with what would now be called traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, and spent 3 years sort of recovering before returning to his Senate seat. He suffered chronic pain and debilitation for the rest of his life. So this dude basically, Brooks gave Sumner like a lifelong pain and illness. And Brooks wasn't really punished for this crime. He just was allowed to do it, which again is crazy for us to think. Can you imagine, like, somebody beating the crap out of somebody else in Congress right now? Like, we would be like, what the hell's going on, right? So, I mean, I don't know. Who knows? So if you take a look at video B, I don't know if you guys have seen Drunk History, but there's a Drunk History clip of this incident, which is always funny, so please enjoy. This is Mr. Charles Sumner, who again had to deal with his traumatic brain injuries for the rest of his life. And traumatic brain injuries are no joke. Like, sometimes you can't work, you can't drive a car, you can't do a lot of things because of your brain injury. So next we're going to talk about that court case that I mentioned with Lincoln's Peoria speech. So this was the case of Mr. Dred Scott, who was a slave. but actually died before he was ever freed. So Dred Scott was born in 1799 and ended up dying on September 17th, 1858. So if you take a look at video C, there's more info about this particular case. So he unsuccessfully sued for his freedom and that of his wife and their 2 daughters in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857, which went all the way to the Supreme Court. Scott claimed that he and his wife should be granted their freedom because they had lived in Illinois and the Wisconsin Territory for 4 years, where slavery was illegal. So in a lot of cases, we kind of talked about this with Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's mistress, that if you go to a territory that's free, you can sometimes petition for your freedom because you're like, well, my master brought me here. Slavery is not legal here. Can I not be a slave anymore? The United States Supreme Court decided 7-2 against Scott, finding that neither he nor any person of African ancestry could claim citizenship in the United States. And therefore, Scott cannot bring suit in federal court under diversity of citizenship rules. So they're saying, you are a black man, you're not a citizen, you don't have the right to petition this in court. Moreover, Scott's temporary residence outside Missouri did not bring about his emancipation under the Missouri Compromise, which the court ruled unconstitutional, as it would improperly deprive Scott's owner of his legal property. So they basically also defined slaves as legal property instead of people. While Chief Justice Roger B. Taney had hoped to settle issues related to slavery and congressional authority by this decision, it aroused public outrage, deepened sectional tensions between the northern and southern states, and hastened the eventual explosion of their differences into the Civil War. So this really made a huge difference. Publicly saying that black people could not be citizens and were property was huge. So, but eventually this decision would be nullified by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which we will talk about later on, freeing the slaves, giving them citizenship, and giving them voting rights for that time being. Member nullification we talked about, so the Dred Scott decision is still in the books, still in Supreme Court history. It just doesn't work anymore now that slavery's gone. Again, unfortunately, Dred Scott died the year after this case, so he never really got to see the Civil War or freedom or any of that, but I believe his wife and his daughters did. Here is one of the court documents from this case. I believe Sanford was his master. And here is a drawing of his 2 daughters who, again, were able to see the end of slavery, but not their father. Okay, and now today, with the last topic, we're going to finish with the big man himself, the man, the legend, right? The first president who was ever assassinated, the log cabin and all that crap. Abraham Lincoln. I usually ask my students at this point in class, like, what do you know about Lincoln? What are the myths, the legends, whatever about him? And they say, oh, he's honest, he's tall, he has that hat, he freed the slaves, all that stuff. Which we'll definitely go a little bit more into Lincoln when we get to the Civil War as well, just to go over what his thought process was with his decisions. And arguably, no president has ever had to deal with something so intense. I mean, like, we have the coronavirus and stuff now, we've had the Great Depression and everything, but we haven't had half of our country split off, and then we had to kill our own former citizens. So it's quite a lot. So Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, and he died, or was assassinated, obviously, on April 15, 1865. He was a statesman, politician, and lawyer who served as the 16th President of the United States from 1861 until his assassination in 1865. And if you take a look at video D, there's a short bio on Lincoln. Lincoln led the nation through the American Civil War, its bloodiest war and its greatest moral, constitutional, and political crisis. He preserved the Union, abolished slavery, strengthened the federal government, and modernized the U.S. economy. Born in Kentucky, Lincoln grew up on the frontier in a very poor family. Self-educated, he became a lawyer, a Whig Party leader. Remember, the Whig Party was the party that eventually turned into the Republicans. State legislature, and congressman. He became a leader in the new Republican Party and gained national attention in 1858 for debating and losing to National Democratic leader Stephen A. Douglas in a Senate campaign. He then ran for president in 1860, sweeping the North and winning. Southern pro-slavery elements took his win as proof that the North was rejecting the constitutional rights of the South. So, as the leader of the modern faction Republican Party, Lincoln confronted radical Republicans who demanded harsher treatment of the South. Okay, so we'll talk about a little bit more next about who hated Lincoln. But here's a picture of him. Again, he's one of the most, if not the most beloved president in our history. Right, amongst such others is George Washington, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, Okay. So Lincoln said on June 16, 1858, in one of these speeches against Stephen Douglas, he said, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." So basically what he's saying, right, is he's like, slavery is going to end eventually, or something's going to happen eventually, whether slavery continue or it be abolished, right? He's like, it's going to have to end one way or another. This is my favorite picture of Lincoln because he looks like a G. So you can find this picture actually in the Hall of Presidents, which is in the Smithsonian Portrait Gallery. They have a portrait of each of the presidents we've had, so super interesting. Okay, so here are the factions, right? Again, radical Republicans wanted harsher treatment for the South. War Democrats, who rallied a large faction of former opponents into his camp. Okay, so the War Democrats really wanted to go to war. Anti-war Democrats called Copperheads, who despised him in general. And irreconcilable secessionists who plotted his assassination. These included the people who ultimately did assassinate him, including the man who did it, John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln fought the factions by pitting them against each other, by carefully distributing political patronage, and by appealing to the American people. So basically, he made them fight amongst each other. He would give some people better positions, right, that he liked, and try to get on the American people's good side. His Gettysburg Address became an iconic call for nationalism, republicanism, equal rights, liberty, and democracy. Lincoln closely observed the war effort, including the selection of generals and the naval blockade that shut down the South's trade, so he was very hands-on in the Civil War. As the war progressed, he maneuvered to end slavery, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. He also ordered the Army to protect escaped slaves, encouraged border states to outlaw slavery, and pushed through Congress the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery across the country. Okay, so he did a lot during the Civil War. Here's an excerpt from his famous Gettysburg Address speech, right after the very bloody Battle of Gettysburg. If you can still visit the battle site, it's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the country, so let me know if you find a ghost. So Lincoln said, "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground." Basically saying, like, don't put up a bunch of memorials, statues, all that stuff, right? He's like, Lincoln and Southern General Robert E. Lee both felt that we shouldn't put up a bunch of monuments for something, that it won't bring back the dead, that we should learn from our mistakes and change rather than just commemorating it. So it's an interesting argument. Here's Lincoln without the beard. Lincoln managed his own re-election campaign since they were in the middle of the war. He sought to reconcile his damaged nation by avoiding retribution against the secessionists, meaning that he didn't seek to really punish the South super badly. A few days after the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, he was shot by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer, on April 14th, 1865, and died the following day. So, as we know, Lincoln was sitting watching a play with his wife in a balcony spot. John Wilkes Booth came up behind him and shot him in the head, I think. Was it the head or the chest? One of those. And then John Wilkes Booth flew down the tapestry next to the balcony onto the stage, broke his leg, yelled some Latin, and then took off. There was a manhunt for him for several days, which a lot of people don't realize. Other secessionists that were a part of the plot were executed. They believe that they caught and executed John Wilkes Booth, although some accounts from soldiers who were at the scene, because the government did it sort of on the down low, said that it wasn't Booth, and that Booth perhaps died in the early 1900s. So it's quite interesting. Right? There's a lot of conspiracy. And again, we'll get more into Lincoln a little bit when we get to the Civil War. That's basically a general summary of his life. So if you take a look at the last two videos, video E is actually Batman, and it's like Batman in an alternate universe if Lincoln was like super powerful and John Wilkes Booth. Like, I'm not even going to spoil it. You guys watch it. And then video F, the last video for today, is a trailer of Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, which is based on a book, which I recommend. I didn't like the movie as much as the book, but which basically Lincoln fights against the South because the South is actually run by vampires. So it's quite interesting. Here Lincoln is. We'll see this picture again when we talk about him in the Civil War with advisors and generals in the Union camp. So he'd actually visit the Union camp himself and sort of say hi to the soldiers and make the battle plans. Again, he was very hands-on. Although, again, he'd be very criticized because of the draft and how many young men were forced to fight in this war. This is Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. This is way bigger than you think it is. It's very grand. It's very interesting, right? Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech in front of this memorial, so it's very iconic. And here Lincoln is with one of his sons. I believe he lost 2 children before he died, which deeply grieved both him and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who we now know had a lot of mental health issues. She came from a slave-holding family, actually, which is kind of ironic. But yeah, they dealt with a lot during their life. So that is it for today. Okay. Next time, we're going to get more into the Lincoln-Douglas debates, right, because those are important. We will also discuss Mr. John Brown, who I mentioned before, who's actually the first man to be executed for treason in this country, and that will end our 10th PowerPoint. So we will begin the Civil War next time with Southern secession, right, when the South decided to finally leave after Lincoln was elected, and we will discuss what Lincoln's plans were for the war, right, because he didn't set out immediately to free the slaves.